Welcome to the L&D Go Beyond podcast. This is the show that brings you real, actionable workplace learning insights from some of the brightest minds in the L&D space. This season, we're diving into the realm of learning impact. Join experts as they share their knowledge and experiences, helping us push the boundaries of what's possible when it comes to delivering impactful learning. Get ready to go beyond. Enjoy the conversation.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this fresh episode of Season 2 of the L&D Go Beyond podcast. You probably already know our focus this season is exclusively on learning impact. And today, we have someone of our own, Clark Quinn, our Chief Learning Strategist, to chat a little bit about designing for learning impact. Hi, Clark. Welcome again to the L&D Go Beyond podcast.
Good day, Amit, and thanks for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
Pleasure is all ours. Clark, let me briefly introduce you to our audience, though I doubt there are many who don't already know you, but just for those who may not have, been acquainted with you yet, Clark Quinn, PhD, provides strategic learning technology solutions to corporations, government, not-for-profit, and educational organizations. An internationally known speaker and author of 7 books, he integrates a deep understanding of thinking and learning with broad experience in technology to improve organizational execution, innovation, and ultimately performance. In 2012, Clark was recognized as the e-learning guild's first guild master. He thinks out loud at learnlets.com, serves as co-director of the Learning Development Accelerator, and works on behalf of clients through Quinnovation. He is, as I said, also the Chief Learning Strategist at UpsideLearning. Clark, again, very happy to have you join us today.
And again, honored to be here with you.
Fantastic. All right. So, we've been doing a few things around learning impact, and, you've done a webinar and you've written an ebook on this topic. I think it'll be kind of a mix of all of those, and let's see if we can, put it through a chat and ask you a few questions around that. Let me start by simply asking, what do you mean by learning impact? When you say learning impact, what are you really referring to?
I think that what matters to organizations is not people having knowledge, but new abilities to do.
Mhm.
And to me, what impact is says the effects that we achieve from any interventions, and it can be performance support as well as learning, but they actually move a needle in the organization that yields either increased revenue or decreased costs, that we are actually identifying a specific need where our performance is less than what we think it should be. And we do an intervention and it affects that, removes that gap so that we are executing on the things we know we need to do.
So essentially, obviously, there's a bit of how do we go there, but fundamentally, it has to impact something that people do, and ultimately, it has to be resulting into some sort of movement of the needle in the right direction.
So it could be up would be, increasing sales or, but it can also be decreasing time for sales to become consummated, to decrease errors.
Yeah.
All those things are potential impacts that have positive effect for the organization, whether they're positive or negative in moving the needle.
Okay. And this is something that, we've together discussed with a few clients, and, we've seen that many times where learning impact may not mean the same, or impact, let's not call it learning impact, but impact of training interventions may not mean the same thing for all organizations. They may be at a different place on their journey. So, two-part question. Are there different levels of impact that we should be okay with? And how do we really manage those different levels of impact, if we have to really talk to stakeholders about what is the learning impact that we are getting out of this program?
Yes, there are levels. If we use the familiar Kirkpatrick model, which has its flaws, and there are better models, but it's widely known. The ideal is what I'm talking about. You identify a problem and you say, what would we be doing differently to do it? So identifying the problem and saying, what should it be is what's level 4 in the Kirkpatrick model. Then you take a step back and say, what would be doing differently in the workplace? And it could be new skills or using newer and better tools like job aids. And then we take, that's level 3. And then level 2 says, okay, let's design the training to get people to do it, or let's design the tool to get it to it, or sometimes both. And then level 1 is asking people, is this having an impact? So you create an intervention and you can ask people about the intervention and say, is this good or bad? Now, the problem with level 1 is novices' assessment of the quality of a learning intervention has very little correlation with its actual real impact. They may not like it, but it's good for them, type of thing. But we can ask better questions and even get good data on that. And different organizations are going to be at different places on this. Some of them aren't even asking at the end of it. They just deliver training. And then other ones begin to ask people, did you like it? Beyond that is assessing their ability at the end of it. That's level 2. Level 3 says, let's see if it's leading to a persistent change in the workplace. And level 4 says, is that actually leading to the impact on the organization we need? Different organizations can be at different places, as I said. And the important thing to do is recognize where you are and start moving up. Nobody expects you to change whole cloth overnight, right? That just is implausible. But whatever you're doing, take the next step and communicate that to your stakeholders. Say, look, right now we're just asking if people like it. We could do a little, get better data on that. And once you start getting better data on that, you go, we could go further. We could see if it's still persisting. We could ask these people not right away, but let's ask them 3 weeks or a month later. And then you start saying, and then we can start deciding, is that actually achieving the impact? So wherever you are, take a step further would be my strategic recommendation.
So I have 2 takeaways from there. Please, confirm if that's okay. One is everybody is on a journey, right? So you may be at step 1, 2, 3, 4, wherever. If we were to really map them to strictly to Kirkpatrick's 4 levels, and it's just that. So that's one. The second part is that you should be moving in the right direction, right? If you are at 1, start making attempts towards going towards 2, maybe then to 3, then to 4, etc. And you may not be at 4 for all your programs. Maybe some of your programs are great for that. Some are good at 3 itself. Is that fair?
Absolutely. You may not be doing level 4 for everything to start with. And even as you move up, you may first target those programs that are designed to have an impact. You're working, if you're in a central organization, you may be working with different business units, and some may be ready for the change and some may be more, just do that stuff you do. Get the traction with the early adopters, and then you can carry that forward to working with, start showing the others, look what we're doing over here, we're getting better input. Wouldn't you like to have those sorts of results yourself? So yeah, you have to be strategic, you have to be practical, make the moves in the places where you're going to get the biggest benefit that you can use to justify going further with this. But in the long term, I sort of have this belief that eventually CFOs are going to wake up and go, we're spending all this money on training. Do we have any evidence that it's actually doing any good? And I'd like us to be ahead of the curve and be ready for that, rather than scramble post hoc and go, oh gosh, now we've got to change everything we do.
Absolutely. I also, sometimes feel there is probably a level 0, which is And quite honestly, I mean, and I'm not trying to, say it in any other way, but I think it's a genuine challenge that some of the L&D folks face, and which is completions itself. Even before you can roll out a survey, I think, and we've had these conversations with some of the clients where they say it's a big challenge to get people to complete. For compliance, they can use a bit of a stick, but for other trainings, it has been a challenge. And it can point to many things. Maybe it's the culture, maybe something else. Sometimes people say there's no time to learn, etc. But if somebody is at that level, do you have uh, you know an advice for that before they start moving on to the others? I thought it will be important to address for some of our listeners.
Yes, absolutely. It was funny. I was in a conversation with a big organization up north of here, and they were the ones who mentioned level zero, just having people attend and complete. And Phillips et al. Will talk about level 5, which is ROI on your investments. Although I think you need to be a little bit careful about that, because you could do something small that has a bigger ROI, but you could do something that has a slightly smaller ROI, but actually is going to have a bigger impact on the organization. But just to get level zero, I myself view compliance as painful in many cases, because that's nobody cares. They don't design it to be engaging and effective, because it's just tick the box, cover your assets type of a business approach. And yet it's there for an important reason, and we can do better. And one of the things I care about and talk about, besides learning science needs to be applied to what we do to make it effective. And hopefully we'll get in a conversation to how do you achieve impact. But just hooking people in emotionally up front and getting their commitment to the experience, and then hopefully the experience delivers on that commitment, is an important part of it. And we don't talk enough about what cognitive science calls the conative part of the experience. Cognitive science says the cognitive, the affective, and the conative. And the conative is your intention to commit effort to learn. And we can affect that. We can help people understand the WIFM, what's in it for me. We can make viscerally aware why this is important to the person, why they do need this, if we wanted to take the effort to make that true. And I think in the long term we should, because you'll get not only better level zero people completing, but also it'll actually make a change in their behavior, which is what these compliance programs should do. And all too often nobody evaluates it, but there's little reason to believe they actually do.
Yeah, I think that's an important reminder. And like you said, we'll probably get into discussing some of those things as to how to make it, how to get better impact out of training programs. But yeah, that sets a good baseline for us, just understanding what do we mean by impact and the different levels that uh, organizations could be at. Let's touch a little bit on why is it so important? I know, and again, we have had conversations. Not every organization is so focused on even measuring learning impact, and hence, of course, not designing for it. But why is it really so important?
Well, a couple reasons. Let's start with what we hear too often is what L&D does. They're order takers. Somebody comes to them and says, I need a course on sales. So, sales aren't up to scratch. They say we need a course on sales. They talk to the experts, create a course that takes all the information the experts have about sales, not what they do for sales, but what about sales. And then they present all that information, and it doesn't actually lead to any change in sales success. What impact says you should do is start and say, let's get very specific. If sales are down, what is the problem? Is it people not following the process? Are they not following up with customers on the right schedule? Is it taking too long for sales processes to complete? Is it in a lack of hit rate on the sales? And start going in and analyzing and saying, what is our barrier? And then very specifically targeting that barrier as a focus of design. Impact says, don't just throw courses at every problem. It says, go in, start by finding out the gap that's the actual problem, and then doing an intervention specifically designed to address that gap. And then you design the solution, and then you measure and make sure you've remedied it before you think you're done. Impact is a process of going from identifying the right target to addressing the right target.
Hmm.
That actually addresses things that affect the bottom line. You and I together heard a talk where somebody was talking about the financial aspects, and increasing revenue or decreasing costs should be the focus. So at the end of the day, it's about money, and that's important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's probably the biggest uh, factor, which is without proper impact. And, obviously making exceptions for where you are on the journey and if you are intending to move to the right direction. But without impact, you are essentially wasting your training dollars.
Absolutely. That's a critical point, is when you're just taking orders, you're creating courses, you're not evaluating any impact. And there's an estimate. Granted, they haven't backed it up, but there's converging evidence that some large percentage, 80, 90% of money spent on training has no impact at all.
Mm.
And that's a tremendous waste of money when you think of the billions that are actually spent on training. So it is an important step to move from being a cost center to actually have an impact on the organization.
Well, absolutely. I know it is something that we kind of encounter often. And this is a situation that we both and a lot more people like us want to change in the domain. Uh, so when we know that there are, that high proportion of courses or programs are not really leading to impact, what, in your view, are the key reasons that prevents organizations from achieving what should have been the desired impact or ideal impact from training investments?
Well, there's multiple converging factors that prevent us from moving forward. And so one of them is being order takers, not being confident enough to work with our business partners to identify those gaps, not wanting, not having the competency to do that proper analysis up front, not being willing to do that proper analysis up front, having a leader or higher ups in the organization that believe if it looks like school, it must be training. If we get up and present information, our tools are oriented towards gathering information, presenting it, and asking questions about it. They want to tell us things and test to make sure we know it. But information isn't the same as actual performance. And giving us the ability to recite new things doesn't necessarily lead us to new behaviors. You need to, if you want to actually impact behaviors, you actually have to have people practice performing those behaviors and give them feedback on their performance to fine tune it and add complexity over time until they're actually doing it. So it's a lack of full knowledge. It's a lack of willingness to fight within the organization. It's a lack of organizational awareness of what it should take. Multiple factors that lead to it. And yet the net result, as you point out, is the fact that at the end of the day, we're wasting a lot of money.
Yeah. Yep, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, just having that right inputs in terms of what leads to proper learning and transfer and all of those things uh, is one part. But then being able to carry it within the organization as a consultant, advisor, etc., is a whole lot of a kind of a very different game. Almost like playing an internal performance consultant.
Right. Actually, there's two more steps, and each of those also has its barriers. So I realize, shame on me, I was largely talking about the upfront analysis and our unwillingness to, or lack of knowledge about its importance and how to do it, and our unwillingness to fight for it is one problem. But then we have to design in a way that's aligned with that problem. And too often we can identify a problem, but then we give information about it. And that's because our subject matter experts literally don't have access to what they do. The way our brain works, it compiles knowledge away and turns it into action. But experts don't necessarily have access to that, but they do have access to the knowledge. So they tend to give us a bunch of knowledge to give the learners, and we give that knowledge to the learners, and we're not going to get any change. So knowing the right design practices is a separate category of barriers. Knowing how to do it and doing it and having the resources to do it, which includes the time to do it properly. If somebody just gives you a bunch of PowerPoints, PDFs, and expects you to throw it on the web with a quiz, as I've already mentioned, and don't give us the time to properly develop practices and the minimum information to do it, we have a barrier there. Then the third area we need is to evaluate what we're doing and test to see if we're actually making that change. We need to know which data matters, have the ability to collect that data, and have the processes to collect that data and evaluate it to determine whether the training intervention is having the impact. So that's a third area of knowledge and skills and all of this needs to be aligned to make it happen. And it sounds complex, but it's actually relatively straightforward. It's not that different than what we do now. It's just fine-tuning the process so that we get these elements in line so we can have an impact.
Let's dive straight into that then, Clark. When you say, we can design for impact, what, in your opinion, is the core steps? Let's say, all the steps that people should be following and not missing out on if they have to really achieve some impact with those training interventions.
Right. Well, the analysis part should have led to some very clear, specific performance objectives we need to achieve. People need to be able to do X in this context to this level. And that's just, may determine the starting level after your intervention, and then you may have ongoing support and should. But once you have those objectives, the very first thing you should be doing is designing the practice that has them doing that. And that's the final practice. And then you look at what will it take to succeed at that practice, and you work backwards. Maybe they need practices of component skills. It depends on how complex this new performance is that they're not doing. Is it just a small change, or is it really a new process we're trying to introduce? So you need to from the objectives, specifically design the practice, then think, what does it take to succeed on that practice? And there's nuances around this. We know that contextualized practice is better than abstract practice. We know that the context practice will determine the space of transfer. And if we want people to be able to perform in a variety of different contexts, which is the case increasingly as our situations become more ambiguous and rote things can be automated, we're going to need to be training for more uncertain contexts, and therefore need to make sure that this practice, the context seen in example and practice, will support appropriate transfer. And then we need to make sure the feedback's specific to their misconceptions, the ways they go wrong, and we should be focusing on that. So there's a lot that goes into the design that's, again, not that different than what we do. It's just creating better practice, providing the right feedback. We're creating practice and feedback. We just need to make sure we understand the nuances and get it right. Using examples, providing mental models to guide performance, and using them that in the examples and the feedback to ensure that there's a consistent message. When we do all this, we're not formal, logical, reasoning beings. And when we just are given information, we don't automatically change our behavior. If we need new behaviors, we need to practice it over time, spaced, getting feedback to learn over the old behaviors. You don't unlearn, you don't forget stuff. What you have to do is explicitly learn over new behaviors that get reinforced until they take over from the previous ones. And when we understand these elements, we can design the practice and resource with the appropriate resources. That's the learning experience.
Interesting. I mean, I capture it in three big parts. Once again, throwing it out for you to validate. One is analysis, of course, getting to, zero in on what is the performance objective. And I think we may be getting wrong on this one more often than not, because we start with objectives are to understand this, to be aware of this, etc. All knowledge-based objectives. So unless we get to performance objectives, the rest of it is not going to really work out. So that's one big one. The second is thinking about what practice will make them capable, proficient in the objectives that we are setting out. Uh, and that's again a very big one because we might be leaning into programs content first rather than practice first, which is what you are saying. Practice first and then see what content is really needed for them to do well on those practice. And then also third part is space out that practice, not just in one program, but space it out over a period of time so that they can build those behaviors.
Yeah. Actually, I still lump that together in the design phase. So there's the analysis, you point out the design. My third phase is evaluation. But you're absolutely right that there's two levels of practice. One is the design of the individual practice, and then the second is the sequence of practices over time. And it should be in varied contexts. You know, what the context you an example and practice are what determine the transfer space. How it gets more complex as your level of ability goes up, how you start adding different, more factors to the practice, and how you extend that beyond the learning event or intervention so that you have the design to what coaching or ongoing reinforcement or tracking, which depends on how complex it is and how important it is and how frequently there are opportunities to practice. All that factors in, but you're right, there are those two levels of practice. I just lump them both into part of the design process, but yes, absolutely.
Okay, excellent. So let's go to the third part, which is the evaluation. You want to elaborate a little bit on that?
Absolutely. So we can look and see if learners can do it right after the learning experience. We can just ask them, did this have an impact? Do you think this is going to enable you? The more expert they are, the better they are at actually evaluating that. But then we can have an assessment that is performed at the end of the learning intervention, and we should, in that we shouldn't determine they're done until they've demonstrated that they can meet the performance objective to the level we established from the analysis phase. But then we should be concerned that it's actually manifesting in the workplace. If you haven't considered the managers and supervisors as part of the solution, they can extinguish it. Oh, that, forget all that stuff you had in that class. That's not how we do it here. Boom, that won't get manifested in the workplace. So you want to see if it's led to a change in the workplace or if other conditions have kept that from happening. When it's persistently being observed as a new behavior in the workplace, a reliable, persistent behavior, then you want to say, now, finally, is that affecting the original performance? And you should have, as part of your analysis phase, says, how are we going to know when we've done, when we're finished, when we've achieved what we're trying to do? You should have a measure you're trying to check. So at each stage, you're looking to confirm that they can do it, they are doing it, and it's having the impact that you need. And so it's identifying the measure and figuring out how you're going to get it. Now, some are tangible or objective. We can actually collect data on sales because we can see what's in the pipeline. We can see whether it closes or not. We can see how long it took to close. Other data is more ephemeral. Customer service. How is this person dealing with customers? We can ask the customers afterwards, but that's slightly subjective. We can have somebody observing them. That's all, with a trained expert, their coach, their supervisor, their floor manager, whatever. We can be observing them. That's still slightly subjective, but it's data. And ideally, the less objective the data, the more we triangulate, look for multiple sources of information. But we want to make sure that we are collecting that and evaluating that to see if it's leading to work. Again, as you reminded us earlier, you may not be ready for all those steps, but wherever you are, start taking the next one and looking for this and thinking about that whole process as a target to be moving to step by step.
Yeah, and it does become a bit of a challenge if you have to measure all of these things because not every organization will have resources or wherewithals to measure all of this for all the programs. But I heard something very interesting where you said, they can do it, they are doing it, and it is having an impact. So to me, can do it is more like, ability to demonstrate in a simulated environment. Are doing it is whether it has been transferred to the job or not, and somebody has to either capture real-time data from systems, or somebody has to observe or maybe see a impact of it. And the final one is it really impacting the business metrics the way we had envisaged? Because there may be a miss there, and you need to refine the whole system again to see if what we wanted to do is really happening. Even if the behavior has changed, sometimes it may not happen.
Yes, and the interesting thing is there are detailed ways to collect this data that are rigorous, but there are lots of shortcuts that can give us data relatively easily. If we just ask at the end of a learning intervention, have them do a final performance, that can give us data. So you're just testing their ability at the end of it. That should be built into every learning experience. It's just an extension. So that you can do. Checking to see if it's happening in the workplace, you're right, is challenging, but in some cases you can just ask either their supervisors or their coworkers or the customers, depending on who they're interacting with, for a sampling. And a representative sampling is good, and people's opinions is better than nothing. So we can lightweight just do some surveys and collect some data and find out whether we think they're doing it in the workplace. The final thing, is it impacting the business metric? You should be collecting that. The organizations collect data on important business metrics. What's measured matters. And so ideally, you're not developing a course until you know what metric you're trying to achieve. So there should be that data. It's just a matter of getting access to it. Many business units say, oh, you can't have access to our data, just go do your training thing, which is a real barrier. You need to find ways for them to actually start finding, working with you and being willing to share the data, because you're going to help them move the needle that matters to them. But that's not necessarily going to happen overnight. And again, then it gets back to strategy. Who are your eager adopters who are willing to do this? Get some traction with them, make a credible case that you can then take to the others and go, do you want to keep living in the dark, or would you like to actually start trying to make meaningful moves? And we have demonstrated that we can assist you with that.
Yeah. You're right. I'm sure businesses are measuring, data which is important. And ideally, those should be the one that will be throwing up gaps and possibly a need for some training intervention. So if we were to link it back to what we were talking about earlier, acting as a performance consultant, maybe a good way is to say, like we have discussed in past, is yes and, which is if somebody comes with a request, you essentially say yes. And how will you know that this has made a difference? What is it that you are currently measuring that you expect to change? And I like that phrase quite a lot. What are you currently measuring that you expect to change? Because you don't have to introduce any new measures. Just tell me, what are you currently measuring? So that could be a good way to possibly bring them on board early in the process, so they know this is the metric that we are both targeting and waiting to see, if this will change with the training program.
And it's really interesting that if you do that upfront analysis, Guy Wallace in his book, The L&D Pivot Point, talks about how many times you will find out that the barrier isn't something that learning can fix, or it's a combination of things, and there's something else that needs to be fixed before you can then do the learning intervention. And that insight is valuable to the organization, but you won't find it out unless you actually go in and look from a performance perspective and say, what isn't happening that should be, and why? And when you understand the why, you can determine there are reasons people don't perform. And it turns out they could do it if they were, had to, if their life depended on it, but they're not doing it for other reasons. Those other reasons may not be anything training can fix, but if you solve them, you may solve the performance problem without having to resort to developing costly training. And one of the things to me that comes out of this is when you start focusing your interventions on specific targets, you may find other solutions than developing an expensive training course that are less costly and equally, if not more, effective. So you start moving from being a training or learning organization to being a performance organization, which is a more benefit to the organization and enables you to more accurately document your actual benefits.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I may add, if you were doing that initial analysis well enough and you got the stakeholders on board, uh, that will also help in setting out a plan for observation and measurement, and when the time comes for that. Otherwise, it can be somebody else's project, and I have been ordered to observe and report, etc. And that can sometimes be a bad position to be in if you have to really measure and report outcomes of programs.
Yeah, but the flip side is when you start doing that, you can start deciding this of all the things people are asking for. These are the ones that are most important. So you can use that as a basis to prioritize what projects you should be focusing on, where you should put your efforts first. And that way you become more strategic to the organization as well. Instead of just being responsive, you're proactive and can go, I can see, I know what my organization's key priorities are right now. It's not increasing sales, it's decreasing costs because our sales are pretty good, but the cost of sales is killing us. So we need to fix that, or the cost of production are too high. And I know that our, next quarter, next year goals are to fix this. Let's figure out where the problem is and we can target that and be investing the resources available to fix the big problems in the organization, increase the organizational success overall.
Excellent. You always talk about the two big pillars of learning impact being retention and transfer. Uh, and you may have covered that in our discussion so far. But if you were to elaborate a little bit on how or what impacts retention and what impacts transfer, so that it's easier for everybody to really uh, correlate some of those parameters. Okay, this will impact retention, and this maybe there are some which impact both.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. A priori, I want to mention that, those are when you need a skill shift. Sometimes we can get better performance by putting information in the world instead of in the head. We can use performance support and provide job aids to make up for gaps or things that it's crazy. You only do it once every 4 months. Trying to put it in the head is going to be really challenging. Why not just put the information in the world to support you the few times you need to do that? But when it needs to be in the head, our goals are twofold, as you mentioned: retention over time until it's needed. If we've invested in a learning intervention, but the learning has atrophied before it's time for it to be applied, it doesn't do us any good. So we need to retain it. And then we need to transfer it. And I already mentioned this briefly: transfer to all appropriate situations and no inappropriate ones. So basically, you've developed the ability to do, it still needs to be there when it is time to do, and it should be done in all appropriate circumstances, not just a few. To get retention, basically that's repeated practice over time, so that and it's not until you get it right, it's until you can't get it wrong. That's what leads to retention. And we under focus on practice, and we under focus on sufficient practice. And yet, if we trim the content down to just the minimum you need, you should be able to generate sufficient practice. And of course, if you want to have an impact, you need to do sufficient practice. So it's that space practice may be varied over time. So you do this, you want a little uncertainty when you face a problem about, is it a chance to apply this particular knowledge? Because that's what happens in the real world. And the more you practice in that context, the better you are going to be able to perform. And then making sure you have across, the different situations you see, you can practice negotiation with a vendor, you can do it with a supplier, you can do it with a contractor, you can do it. There's a variety of different ways. The more you practice in different circumstances, the more likely you are to use it in all the circumstances you need to do it. So those are the two factors we really want. I like to generate a third that isn't officially part of learning science to my knowledge, but I would like them to have developed the confidence sufficiently at the end that the next time it's an opportunity to apply it, they will give it a go, because they may know it's the right thing to do, and they may recognize it's the right context, and they may have the skills still, but they're not willing to try it because they're afraid of failing or something. And you need to have built their confidence sufficient that they're willing to give it a go. But that's not official principle. That's my own interpretation as far as I know.
Excellent. Okay, let's take a slightly different view of it, like you have in your ebook, which is how do we avoid impact? Let's take a completely different view of it.
Right. So why do you want this impact? It just exposes you to risk. If you measure things, you might not be achieving what you think you're achieving. So let's not even risk it. Let's just take orders for courses, do what people tell us, and then we have a good defense. We can say they've asked for this and we did it what they said. If it didn't work, it's their fault for asking for the wrong thing. We're covering our assets that way. And if we don't do analysis, just ask for it. If we just make sure we present the right information, it's the blame's on the learner, right? We gave them the information. If they didn't change what they did, it's their fault, not our fault. Don't worry, nobody knows about learning science. We can tell them this and they'll believe it because they don't know any better. And evaluation, oh yeah, we don't have to collect data. We don't have access to it, and it's too hard, and nobody's asking for it anyway. So let's just stop. There's at every stage we can find good barriers to doing it the right way, and we can find ways to do it in ways that don't give us any risk, and we'll be fine until somebody actually cares. Then we might be in trouble. But meantime, I'm close to retirement anyways. Who cares? It'll be somebody else's problem.
Excellent. Right, Clark, anything else that you want to add which we may not have covered in our questions?
No, yes, there is one thing I'd like to add, and it's just, I'm not the only one, and you and I are not the only ones who care about this. It is a trend we're seeing in the organization, in organizations as a whole. And I think it's one people should start proactively addressing. I'm pleased to work with you because you are working on this, and this is another opportunity to try and share this message. But I think it's a growing recognition, a growing thing that's going to happen, and I encourage people to get on top of it. If you want to help, lots of people who want to help, including us. But let's please continue to make our endeavors worthy of being proud.
Thank you. Thank you for those closing words, Clark. It was lovely again chatting with you. Thank you so much for your time today.
No worries. A pleasure talking with you, Amit.